warm welcome to Macros with Mythili, the ET Now show that takes a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. In this edition, we're going to take a hard look at the ongoing controversy over the Employees Provident Fund, the EPF. Though the Finance Minister Arun Jaitley has now gone on record to say that he will not tinker with EPF anymore, his statement comes after a series of controversies. The latest was the unprecedented move of the Finance Ministry to overturn the decision of the Employees Provident Fund Organization, EPFO, Central Board of Trustees, regarding the interest rate to be paid by the fund to its members. And though the ministry finally gave in, the move was widely seen as part of the broader effort of the government to make the EPF less attractive compared to its Johnny-come-lately rival, the NPS, the new pension scheme. Remember, it's not the first time the government has interfered to alter the status of the EPF scheme. Starting with the budget, when the FM introduced changes in the taxable status of the scheme and subsequently had to retract in the face of opposition from employees, to modifications in the regime governing withdrawals, where once again the government had to backtrack, to this latest attempt to reduce the interest rate paid to its employees, the government seemed determined to restructure the EPF. Indeed, just as determined as the employees are to maintain status quo. So what is the reality? Is the EPF an outdated, badly run scheme as the Finance Ministry would have us believe? Or is it the savior that trade unions say it is? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between, which is why in this edition of Macros with Mythili, we've got a panel of experts who will give us a complete picture of what's good and what's bad about the EPF. Do we have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, or can we rescue what's good about the scheme while remedying what's bad? I have with me Narendar Paani, Professor, School of Social Sciences, National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bengaluru; Gautam Bhardwaj, Director, Pinbox Solutions, and one of the earliest in the country to draw attention to the need for pensions and social security in India; and Kulin Patel, Director, Towers Watson, who belongs to that rare breed of actuaries. Welcome to the show, all three of you. Let me start the ball rolling by asking each of you in turn a very simple question. If you were an employee, a blue-collared employee in India, mind you, not a white-collared one, with a monthly salary of say between 15 to 20,000 and a choice between the EPF and the NPS, which one would you opt for and why? I just want a very brief answer to this because we'll get into the details a little later in the discussion.
Well, I would prefer the Employees Provident Fund with the option of withdrawal, which will allow you to shift funds to a pension fund like the one available with LIC as a matter of your choice and not that of the government.
Okay, let me ask you, Gautam. Paani is very sure it would be the EPF, but with some choices, and he wants, in fact, the choice of withdrawal, about which I have perhaps a different perspective. But what about you? Remember, you have to keep in mind the typical scenario facing the blue-collared workers in India: a number of mouths to support, no other social security, no pension other than what the EPS promises. So what would your take be, EPS or NPS?
I think, Mythili, very frankly, I would choose the NPS. And I think the NPS was, as you know, originally designed for a population in this income bracket. Not necessarily people in the salaried workforce, but frankly, nobody is in any occupation on a permanent basis. So you will find people migrating from salaried employment to self-employment and so on and so forth. They will move jobs and locations. I think the NPS is the better choice for this
Even though there is no guarantee whatsoever of the return that you will get?
Well, I think the NPS, regardless of the fact that it doesn't have a guarantee, is already performing much better than the EPFO in terms of returns. But as you said, I think there are deeper issues here, which we can surely discuss.
Kulin, what is your take? And would it be different if you were a white-collared rather than a blue-collared employee in India?
Well, I think the role of the EPF originally was there for sort of the working, blue-collar status worker. And so I think that still the blue collars value the EPF a great deal. I think it'll give them the assured, sort of stable build-up of funds that they require, certainly at the earnings levels that they have. However, I think the situation is slightly different for the white collar. I think using the fact that there's no universal system, I think the EPF can act very much so as a baseline and a foundational pillar, which we can get into a bit later on. But the white collar staff can actually build upon that, and that's where I actually see the advantages of NPS for the build-up of further growth into your corpus.
So you would argue for both to continue?
For a bit of both, and I think they have their own roles and unique propositions to both.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, well, Paani would prefer the EPS, Gautam the NPS, and Kulin wants to have both. But Paani, one of the intriguing things really about the controversy is that the EPFO says the payment is going to be made out of its own earnings. And in fact, the Financial Audit and Investment Committee, consisting of representatives of the employees employees, the employers, the government, all projects that the EPFO would earn close to 35,000 crores in 2015-16. And that would be sufficient to offer an interest rate of 8.95% to the retirement fund body's 50 million subscribers. In fact, according to the estimate given by them, after paying an interest of 8.8%, the EPFO would still have a surplus in the region of roughly 700 crores. So why is the Finance Ministry interfering? After all, the Finance Ministry does not interfere with, say, mutual fund payouts, for instance. So what could there be the justification in this case at all, Paani?
Well, I see this as a part of a larger problem with governing the Indian economy, which is that we import ideas from abroad and then implement it here, expecting it to work as well. As far as pension funds are concerned in India, we must remember that life expectancy in India is much less than in the advanced countries. Despite our recent spurt in life expectancy, there are states in India where it is hardly about 64, 65. And if you take the fact that, we must recognize that the EPF and Provident Fund works not just for the 15 to 20,000 bracket, but much lower brackets as well, including, say, the 4,000 to 5,000 bracket of government workers. And if you look at that, you're telling them in effect, given the life expectancy, that they save throughout their lifetime, throughout their working life, for a benefit for the last 6 years. And that is something that I think is a sort of option that is just not acceptable. Now, in that kind of context, if you say that I'm going to put together a particular fund and then develop it into a pension fund, it's all very well, but it's not going to have the support of the people on the ground. Unfortunately, much of our economic policy, and I've written about this extensively, as you know, is not based upon what affects the people on the ground, which is one of the reasons why you have zero employment. I mean, these are all different issues, but you end up with an economic strategy that gives you very high growth rates, but still a great deal of dissatisfaction on the ground.
Gautam, would you agree with Paani? He says it's very unrealistic at all to think in terms of something like the EPF. And what are the government's concerns regarding the EPF? Are these concerns valid at all? Why shouldn't the government say you should not pay out so much? Is there a case at all for this? Because Paani feels that the government is just interfering because it's trying to import, practices taken from abroad into an Indian scenario, and it just doesn't hold.
Well, my view is that I think there is clearly a role for an institution like EPFO for certain reasons, as Kulin was also saying. And I think the primary role for an institution like EPFO is that they have the ability to force contributions. Now, people who are in the 4,000, as Mr. Paani was saying, 4,000 to say 15,000 kind of a salary bracket, their current consumption needs are so huge that left to themselves, most of them would not save for old age. So I think there is clearly a role, and this is not necessarily only the case for blue-collared, lower-income people. This is equally the case for higher-income people. I mean, if you look at the NPS, we've got, I think 50% of the membership in NPS is of civil servants. 90% of the savings in NPS belong to the civil servants. 100% of the persistency in savings belongs to civil servants. And the reason is that they are forced to participate in the NPS and they are forced to contribute. And I think that's a useful role for the EPF. The reason the Ministry of Finance, I think, needs to step in and do so quite frequently is because a lot of the decisions related to the EPF seem to be political decisions. They should not be political decisions. I mean, ideally, these should be decisions that are in the best interests of workers and are produced as a result of the design of the architecture.
Yeah, because if you're earning that kind of return and you can pay it, there's no reason for the
I shouldn't have to burn buses.
Absolutely.
Now, when you burn buses to demand, say, higher tax incentives, and if you look at the EPF subscriber base, 80% of the assets or the corpus of EPFO belongs to 20% of the higher income people.
No, but my point, Gautam, is why is the government interfering? If the fund has the money to pay out, if it has got those kind of returns, why is the finance ministry saying don't pay 8.8, pay only 8.7? Because as long as they're not turning to the government in order to make that payment, why is the government interfering?
Because I think a lot of the decisions on this are being driven by politics and not being driven by the underlying reality. So if in NPS, for instance, you don't see these arguments, you don't see the Ministry of Finance interfering and saying, forget mutual funds. Even in NPS, I mean, there is no determination of a return. If the NPS is delivering 12%, it's delivering 12%. If it falls to 11 or rises to 13, so be it. So the Ministry of Finance doesn't have to play a role. Here, the returns are being, so you are investing in G-Secs, you're earning less than what you want to deliver, and you will force the government to deliver more by simply burning buses. I think this is a bad precedence.
Okay. Kulin is somebody who has a much greater understanding of the intricacies, apparently, especially of actuarial science. How wise is it for the fund to make these aggressive payouts after interest rates are falling, and the CBT's recommendation will necessarily have to be seen as aggressive? Does the fund, to your knowledge, do a proper actuarial estimation of its liabilities? And are the government's concerns because they feel that the government might ultimately have to step in because we don't have a proper actuarial calculation of its liabilities?
Yeah, so obviously with the Provident Fund being, the large part of it being the fund piece, but also being the EPS piece. The EPS piece being the defined formula benefit that it has, and even the contributions are defined. So there's a kind of a balance there. There is an actuarial done every few years. Okay. And that measures the sustainability of that particular
piece. And
piece.
you're satisfied with the quality of the actuarial?
Well, I think this, where the confusion has potentially been in the past in interactions where I've been involved in an actuary is when it comes to sort of social security versus a funding for a particular plan, what sort of techniques do you use? Okay. In many parts of the world, when you're talking about social security financing, and Gautam's got some experience of this as well, you're talking about intergenerational. So you're really looking at, is the money that you're getting in from people now enough to meet their payout now? And therefore, what is my future projection of the workforce and dependency ratios and everything? And that I know that studies have been done with the help of the World Bank. That shows that for the EPS portion, we're reasonably healthy for quite a few number of years.
So we don't have the kind of hole that the US Social Security has?
On that particular basis of pure cash flow. Okay. If you look at it in another scenario where you're saying, okay, if I total up all the liabilities and put a present value on that today in an actuarial sense, and then compare that against the fund that's been allocated, that then, I believe, in an actuarial valuation of just 2 or 3 years ago, has shown a big deficit. Okay. So I think we just need to be cognizant of the fact that when we talk about actuarial, what methodology is being talked about? Because one will show a huge deficit, I think some 60,000 crores plus. But on the other hand, if you're talking about on an ongoing basis, we can meet the payments that there are. Okay. But it is important for the Finance Ministry to keep an oversight on these things, because at the end of the day, they will be the finance holders and the budget holders in generations to come. So
that really is the fear, that the Finance Ministry and government, that is ultimately taxpayer money, might have to be used to pay out the obligations under the EPF, particularly the EPS. But I'm afraid on that note, it's time for us to slip into a very short break. But please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing the ongoing controversy about the EPF, which, though it seems to have been resolved for the moment, is bound to resurface once again. Gautam, before the break, Kulin voiced a fear that many economists have also voiced in the past, that the fear that, the fund may not have a proper estimation of its future payout obligations, and hence a day may come when there will be a hole that will have to be filled from taxpayer coffers. How valid is that fear? Because we've heard it in the case of the US also, their Social Security has a big hole, and that is why the government is interfering. So is this a valid fear at all?
I think this is a valid fear. We've seen the scheme is barely 20 years old. And we've seen progressively the shortfall on the asset and liability side on the EPF. But the EPF
scheme goes much further. The EPS is relatively new, but the EPF goes back much further.
So, Mythili, the liability gap is a worry only in the employee pension scheme or the EPS.
Or even in the case where they're paying a higher rate of interest, because very often they say we really don't know whether the returns that the EPF is saying it is actually earning. So even the issue of the surplus is often disputed.
Well, that's a different issue. So I think one is, do I have enough money to pay the benefits 30 years later to somebody in the EPS,
pension,
right?
the pension
on the pension side. There, I think we clearly have a problem. The size of the gap between the assets and liabilities is continuing to increase.
Okay. Even though the pension payout is very nominal, if you look at the amounts, 1,500, 2,000 is about the maximum, I think.
So that's the second problem, which is that not only is this going to, at an aggregate, cause a significant cost a fiscal cost at somewhere in the future. But also, I think the size of the benefits themselves might be insufficient to provide a meaningful retirement outcome. Okay? They're not inflation indexed and so on and so forth. The second, which is on the EPF, and that's where the problem is, returns earned by EPF. Say if I'm an EPF subscriber, then returns earned for the year on my savings should be a statement of fact. It should not be determined by burning buses. It should be determined by just simple mathematics in saying, this is what I invested this here.
But in democracies, most issues are not determined, I agree, not by burning buses, but not determined on the basis of mathematics, unfortunately, Gautam. So ultimately there has to be a social security angle also, no? What you pay out should have some relation to what the returns are like, what the need is like also, or no?
Which is, I
as long as they don't leave as long as they don't leave a deficit. So the question is there a deficit or not?
So on EPS, there is a deficit.
There is a deficit.
On EPF, there need not be a deficit on a long-term basis. There could be a year-to-year deficit. So I'm earning 6.5%, and I want to declare 8.5%. So who pays the balance 2%? Especially when you're looking at, say, a 5 lakh crore kind of a corpus size. So somebody has to bear that cost.
So as long as the return that you're declaring, the CBT, that Central Board of Trustees is declaring, is within the earnings, there should be no problem.
They should. Then nobody needs to burn a bus. Ministry of Finance doesn't have to step in and say, don't offer this,
but that is what they have done this time. The EPF says that we are in a position to pay out even 8.9. The Finance Ministry says no, because we brought down the rate of return on small savings, so they say pay out only 8.7. So in this particular case, was their stand valid?
Perhaps not. If the returns are...
If they are, but that is a question mark.
And in the past we've seen, say 25 years ago, EPFO used to be earning more and paying less. In some years earning less and paying more than it was earning. So all I'm saying is that in an ideal world, the practice of declaring returns in the beginning of the year, I don't see how that can happen. It can only happen saying, I invested your money for this last 1 year, this is the money you earned, and this is the interest, therefore, that your savings have got.
Absolutely.
So it should be a statement of fact. It should not be anything else.
So part of the problem really is that it's a bureaucratic decision really. And Paani, you spoke of the angst of blue-collared workers in India. Never mind that frankly they are amongst the lucky 10% of the population that has some job security as part of the organized labor force in the country. In fact, the vast majority really has no such comfort. And to that extent, what should the government's aim be? Should it be to get more of the labor force into the organized sector, or accept the reality and facilitate access to NPS, the new pension scheme, which unlike the EPF is open to everybody, including the self-employed?
There's just one thing, like when we're looking at people who benefit from the Employees Provident Fund, it's a mistake to think about it. I think you're looking at it at a slightly higher bracket than is the reality in many cases. As if you look at government workers, they have no job security. The attrition rates are high. Most of them work for about 2 to 3 years in a job and then are forced to move on. And they all have access to Provident Fund. So to see it purely as something that of the kind of elite workforce is not entirely correct. But more than that, I think the real issue that we need to come to, since people have already spoken about burning buses, is that when you're talking about savings over a lifetime, it's got a strong cultural dimension to it. We are looking at trying to have something that we have faith in. No matter what we have done with the economy, with liberalization, the faith in gold remains very, very strong. And whenever we build up alternative sort of instruments, and the EPF was developing into one, we have a tendency to destroy it first. And that is largely the problem here. We are not recognizing the cultural dimension. If I may just take a minute, if you look about burning buses again, the most recent case was when 100,000 workers, mainly women of the garment industry, came out on the streets in Bangalore. I don't think too many buses were burnt being women, but nevertheless there was a degree of violence in it. And in fact, police firing as well. And in that entire process, what caused it was the fact that it was a reaction to the fact that you couldn't withdraw the EPF. And if you look at this industry, it is women who come in at 18, and a large number of them quit at 22, 23 after they have earned enough to get married, or to help the marriage process, not necessarily a dowry. Now, this kind of process, you can fight it on the grounds that it is your anti-dowry or whatever it is, but this is a part of the Indian reality. And if I come here, I spend my youth in a factory in the hope of some little gain that will help me take the next step in life. And then somebody sitting in Delhi says this is not the way it's done in the US. I have no option but to burn buses.
No, but Paani, that's because you're looking at it a little differently, because EPF is never meant to provide for your dowry or provide for your house, though in fact you are allowed to withdraw for house construction. But just hear me out, because if you really wanted to save for your dowry, you open a recurring deposit in a bank. The EPF is a provident fund. It's a social security for the time that maybe in your old age you're no longer able to earn. So we're looking at the wrong instrument. EPF was never meant to provide for that dowry or to provide for an expensive sari. If you wanted to do that, the women should have opened a recurring deposit with the bank. So isn't that part of the problem, that we have not told the EPF story correctly?
Can I just have a word here?
Yeah.
The issue is the issue is really that instruments of saving emerge from the ground. You must remember that savings has a precautionary element to it. And when you're dealing with a precautionary element, what matters is what I believe will give me a safety in a time of crisis, not what somebody in Delhi believes. Right? And the issue here is the EPS has emerged as something that has gained this credibility. It is very silly for any economic manager to destroy it or to destroy their credibility. There aren't too many instruments savings instruments in India that have developed that credibility. This is reflected in the declining savings rate. And if we are going to take a textbook view of this process and not recognize the 10 pressures that are emerging on the ground, we will have a price to pay.
Gautam, would you agree with Paani, or is it there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what the Provident Fund is meant to do? My understanding of the Provident Fund is that it's meant to be a social security for old age or for buying a house or things like that. Not really for providing for some special, sudden exigencies. For that you have nationalized banks which do give you fixed deposits at a contracted rate of interest. Would you agree with Paani, or should the effort really then be to reform the EPF, tell people what it's meant to be, and tell them there are alternative instruments if they wanted to fulfill some other needs?
So, I mean, I think I agree with what you're saying, which is that I think there is very little understanding at the field level among EPF subscribers, and I would say 85% of them just don't see this as a retirement savings option. They just see this as an umbrella savings scheme, which they're forced to participate in. They don't even realize that the full 24% that they're contributing is actually their CTC. It's not really going in from the employer's pocket, it's going from theirs. Now, to a certain extent, I agree with Narendra Paani that the contribution rate itself is so high that it doesn't leave any headroom for savings for other requirements that the EPFO then is forced to allow. Now, the EPFO says you can withdraw for, say, health or housing or marriages or education. Now, all of these are life cycle needs of all human beings. Now, if that be the case, why should I force you to save a quarter of all of your savings in EPFO and then allow you and drip feed you on this, and then force people to resort to violence and so on and so forth if I was to curb this? Ideally, you could lower the contribution rate. Okay. You could improve returns by perhaps not through violence but by better investments. Okay. And you could then have a situation where people have better savings for old age and simultaneously have some savings separately available for, like you have in the NPS tier 1, tier 2.
So Kulin, would you agree with that the best way to do is lower the contribution to EPF and allow the option of both EPF and NPS, because both fulfill different needs perhaps?
Yeah, and I think that's what I was saying right at the start of the show about the ability to segment each type of scheme. So I mean, I agree wholeheartedly with Paani in the sense that on the ground, people see this as a savings. When I speak to employees, when I'm speaking and doing presentations on behalf of corporates, they have this perception that the money's being taken away from me, but then
I have no say in the matter.
I have no say in the matter, and what am I actually saving it for? The retirement piece, I know that there's various statistics that are bandied about that actually at retirement, say that the 55, 58 years of age, how much of the person's contribution in total is really left at the end? It's very, very small portion. Very little. Which means that the value people are actually gaining, and especially at the lower income level, is to meet life goals. Now that is not the purpose of the NPS. So surely a solution can be there with the fact that people are seeing this as a social security with the EPF. which so in its widest sense for social security, it should meet the needs of when you are ill, you don't have access to health care, which is universal. You don't have access to
Except that one thing that is definite is you're going to grow old. So the entire life goal of old age security and pension
has to be taken care of somewhere else.
That must also be taken care of along with your house, along with the marriage, along with sickness. I think that really is the problem, that we haven't been able to tell people that there is, I mean, there's nothing that you can, old age is something that is inevitable, so you need to save for that also as part of the life goal.
Absolutely.
But I'm afraid we're completely out of time, so we'll have to end this discussion. What is clear is that the EPF plays a vital role in providing some social security in a scenario where there's virtually no social security worth the name for the vast majority of workers. But does it do it in the best possible way? Not really. There's enormous scope for improvement, both in the operational efficiency as also in customer service. Computerization certainly helps, but along with that, the fund needs to tone up its operations so that its members get the maximum bang for the buck. If competition from NPS forces the fund to look sharp, that can only benefit its members. So with that, we come to the end of this program. Thank you so much, Paani, Gautam, as also Kulin, for joining me in this discussion. Thank you also for watching. Remember, we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/etnow.